Okay, I'd like to welcome everybody here today to our fourth talk this year in our Curious Minds, formerly Writers, Speakers, and Ideas series. And my name is John Barr, and I'm a history professor here at Lone Star College-Kingwood and the chair of the committee that does the work that puts this on. So usually in the past, these have been in person, and one day we all hope they will be again. But for today, there's a picture of our beautiful campus and some previous talks that we've held. And today we will have Felipe Hinojosa, a professor of history at Texas A&M University, to speak with us about his book, Apostles of Change, Latino Radical Politics, Church Occupations and the Fight to Save the Barrio. This series is premised on the idea that talking about books is as important educationally as are the books and the subjects themselves. Usually these take place on Fridays at noon. Next, in 2 weeks, on Friday, October the 15th, we have a graphic novel, Finding History in Funny Places, The Making of the Great Hanoi Rat Hunt, where Professor Michael Vann will speak with us about his book, The Great Hanoi Rat Hunt. And I believe several of our students and classes are reading that book this semester, so we'll be looking forward to that. But for today, we have Dr. Hinojosa on campus, which we're very excited and grateful to hear him speak with us. So the format is pretty simple today, and that is we're going to introduce the series. Of course, we're doing that now, and then Dr. Hinojosa will speak for somewhere around 35, 40, 45 minutes, and then we will have a Q&A session afterwards. There's a couple of ways we can do the question and answers. You can type those in the chat, and those will come to me, and I'll put those questions out to everyone else as the talk is progressing. Or I believe I know now how to, it's taken me some time to learn it, but I believe I know how to allow you to ask your question of Dr. Hinojosa on camera if you wish to do that. I just have to make you a panelist temporarily. So during the Q&A and during his talk, think about the questions you want to ask and type those in the chat. And after his talk is over, and as you think about those Q&A, we'll ask questions of Dr. Hinojosa for about 15 to 20 minutes. As the host of this, I reserve the right to ask the first question, which I've kind of got an idea of what I want to ask in advance. So you'll just have to wait on that, Dr. Hinojosa. So Dr. Hinojosa was born and raised in Brownsville, Texas, and he received his PhD from the University of Houston in 2009, about the same time as me, actually. And he joined the faculty at Texas A&M that same year. His research areas include Chicano and Latino studies, American religion, race and ethnicity, and social movements. In addition to serving as the director of the Carlos H. Cantu Hispanic Education and Opportunity Endowment, Professor Hinojosa serves as editor for the interdisciplinary, peer-reviewed, and online moderated forum Latinx Talk. His work has appeared in Zocala, Public Square, Western Historical Quarterly, American Catholic Studies, Mennonite Quarterly Review, and in edited collections on Latina studies. Dr. Hinojosa's first book, Latino Mennonites, Civil Rights, Faith, and Evangelical Culture, was awarded the 2015 Americo Paredes Book Award for the best book in Mexican American and Latino Studies by the Center for Mexican American Studies at South Texas College. I should add at this point that he also spoke on this book, Latino Mennonites, on our campus at our book festival here in 2015. So we're glad to have him back. And as long as this campus is here and I'm here, if you publish a new book, Felipe, we're going to have you on campus to speak about it. His new book is Apostles of Change, Latino Radical Politics, Church Occupations, and the Fight to Save the Barrio, published by University of Texas Press. It's set in 4 major cities, Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, and Houston, where in 1969 and 1970, Latino radical activists clashed with religious leaders as they occupied churches to protest urban renewal, poverty, police brutality, and racism in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And without any further ado, Dr. Hinojosa, let me make you the host and presenter. And there you go. It's all you.
Great, John. Thank you so much. Is there a way to share my screen so I can put up the PowerPoint? How would I do that?
You should see share at the bottom of the screen. Can you move your cursor down and see that share?
Yes, but it is not highlighted.
Okay, it should be because I made you the presenter. That's not a problem. I can continue to share my screen with you, and you can just say next slide.
Okay.
Let me just call up the PowerPoint very quickly. That won't take long.
Great. Well, listen, while you do that, I just want to thank you and, just wish everybody a good afternoon. I know at least if you're in Houston, it's raining, College Station, it's raining, and there's a lot going on. So I appreciate everybody that's out there that made some time to be with us this afternoon. And a special thanks to you, John, for this gracious invitation to talk about this book and to get it going. And I'm just going to go ahead and get started, John. And I won't get into first slide until a little bit. So while you're putting that up, I'm just going to jump into the talk, if that's okay.
Go ahead. I've got it. I'm just going to share it here real quick, if I can.
All right.
Yeah, I don't know what's happening there. Okay, hold on just 1 second.
Sure.
I'm going to make myself the host again, that way, or presenter. Maybe that's the problem. There.
Yeah, this is a new format I've never used. Usually
Sure.
I'm just on Zoom, and so
Sure.
There you go. That's it.
Yep, and we are all set. And you just tell me when to advance the slide, and I'll do it. Great.
Appreciate it, John. Thank you. So first of all, let me just say that part of what I've committed my work to and my scholarship, I think, has been about and really sort of struggling with how to tell the story or stories, right, of the Latino freedom movement. They are complicated. They are plural, right? Regional, politically diverse, with radical and reformist tendencies. And I suppose that some could even push back against the notion of a Latino freedom movement and instead focus on Chicano and Puerto Rican movements. I'm not against that argument. I certainly welcome that. I'm open to that. And actually, that's really where we all start, to be honest. Certainly where I started at the University of Houston in graduate studies there. But I think there's also a lot of new scholarship that is pointing us in the last few years that has pushed us to more clearly think about kinship, about cooperation, about coalitions, really pushing us to think about what is actually happening on the streets of South Texas, of California, of New York City, Chicago, and other places, Des Moines, Iowa, right, of all places, right? That I think a lot of scholarship has begun to sort of unravel the fact that rather than a competition, rather than movements isolated within their own ethnic enclaves, what we are finding are coalitions and cooperation, a form of kinship and a sense of a shared yet a distinct struggle, right? And here I'm thinking about the work of historians Luis Alvarez, Max Krochmal, Joana Fernandez, and Eduardo Contreras in particular, although there are many more out there that are doing this kind of coalition building work. And what we're learning about kinship and connectivity, I think, really sort of pushes the boundaries of what we think about the barrio and of neighborhoods in particular. Think for a minute about how your own barrio, your own neighborhoods are wired up in complex and identifiable ways. An enormous system of resource sharing, of ideas, of gossip, of chisme, right? Politics, and large established movements, I think, especially in the 60s and 70s, but even today, that that sort of helps subsidize even smaller movements. And I'll say more about what I mean in particular about that. It's a type of reciprocal interdependence, I think, and cooperation across barrios and across neighborhoods, across families and friendships and so forth. And in the stories that I want to share with you all today, I'm looking at religious institutions, not only as spaces of occupation, although that's what the book is about, right? Or simply as a colonial force, as a negative kind of technology, as a technology of discipline that works to contain certain human impulses, right? But looking at how this central institution transforms at the ground level, locally focused as a space of support for radical and reformist movements. And that idea of radical and reformist, I think, will make sense as I move forward. I think what this does, and what a lot of the scholarship has been talking about in the last few years, is really about thinking about sort of the absolutely limitless possibilities that lie within the teaching, writing, and speaking of Latinx history. And I'm so honored to be here today, and just really excited about talking to you all today about Latinx history, the freedom movements, and what this means for us today. So let me just go ahead and jump in and tell you what I've been up to these last few years in writing this book. So I start in Chicago. The people gathered at Orlando Davila's home on the night of May 3rd, 1969, saw it all happen. First shouting coming from the street in front of Davila's house, then the realization that it was a man with a gun pointed right at them. And the next moment, 2 shots fired. One of those shots hits Manuel Ramos in the head near his right eye. Another shot hits Rafael Rivera in the neck. Chaos ensues when the man with the gun, later identified as off-duty police officer, Officer James Lamb, was seen walking away from the scene. Lamb later testified that he fired his weapon only after he heard shots fired from across the street. When he proceeded to investigate, he reported seeing 3 men, one of whom he heard say, "Get away from there or I'll blow your head off," and another that he reportedly saw reach for a weapon. Witnesses refuted Lamb's testimony, arguing instead that the police officer was the aggressor. The remaining details of that night are murky, but we know that as Manuel Ramos and Rafael Rivera were taken to the hospital, 4 of their good friends, Pablo Martinez, Jose Lind, Sal de Rivero, and Orlando Davila, all part of the group that called themselves the Young Lords Organization, were arrested, taken into custody, and tried for assaulting an officer. Manuel Ramos died later that night. James Lamb, the police officer who shot and killed and wounded Rivera, was cleared of any wrongdoing. Manuel Ramos was a father, he was a husband, he was a brother. His death robbed his 2 children, a 2-year-old daughter and a 6-month-old baby boy at the time, of their father. Those that knew him best described him as a quiet, mild-mannered man. He served as Minister of Defense for a Young Lords organization that in 1969 was still trying to find its way, still working to see how best they could help their community, still learning the intricacies of revolutionary politics. Ramos's death, however, would serve as a turning point for this young militant group. His death brought together his fellow Young Lords from the Lincoln and Humboldt Park neighborhoods in Chicago, as well as members of the Black Panthers and the white Appalachian group known as the Young Patriots, at his memorial service at St. Teresa's Catholic Church. His death and the solidarity that came from Black and white revolutionary groups sparks a political fire in the members of the Young Lords. It was also a key moment for the person that you see there on the screen, the leader of the Young Lords, Jose Chacha Jimenez, or better just known as Chacha, who later confesses to journalist Frank Browning that the murder of Manuel Ramos was, quote, "the point that I became a real revolutionary." Next slide, please. Manuel Ramos's death added fuel to an already, and this is, by the way, an artistic rendition of Manuel Ramos here. His death added fuel to an already active organizing presence in Chicago neighborhoods, from Uptown to Lawndale to Lincoln Park, as multiple groups turned up the heat in the summer of 1969. Black, Latino, and white activist groups occupied institutions. They established breakfast programs for school children. They organized rallies. They opened health clinics, published newspapers that promoted really solidarity across race and ethnicity, and really across barrios and neighborhoods in the city of Chicago. Mutual aid was only part of the story, however. Across the nation, cities burned in the late 60s. The historian Elizabeth Hinton has noted that it was a violence and death on a scale not seen since the Civil War. Every major urban center in the country burned during those years. The history of Latinos in urban America in the 1960s, their struggles against displacement, poverty, police brutality, and violence are ones that, even with all of the great work that has been published, especially in the last 10 years, remains for the most part not yet fully understood. The stories of how Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans simultaneously turned to violence and to mutual aid to secure equal rights, improve unequal conditions, and push back against displacement remain for the most part understudied. Next slide, please. Now, I certainly didn't intend and expect to be delving into this history. This is a picture of the cover of the book. I mean, my first book, as John was mentioning, was about Latinos in the Mennonite Church in rural Puerto Rico and in South Texas. But these stories of urban America hooked me in and really just never let me go. The fantastic photographs that I was able to find, the deep political meaning, all of it gripped me. I realized that these stories of church occupations were about Latinos and their place in the American city, about their fights against displacement, and about the long tradition of mutual aid, which, by the way, continues to this day, especially in this moment of this COVID-19 pandemic. Now, this is also a deeply personal story for me. Ever since I can remember, I have been fascinated by church buildings, the art and symbols that decorate their walls, the public space that engulfs them, and the spiritual meanings they carry for marginalized communities. Much of this fascination has to do with my own upbringing. I grew up as a preacher's kid. And yes, all the stereotypes are true, which meant that I spent a lot of time in churches, all right? Sunday mornings, Sunday nights, Wednesday nights, it was a lot, okay? Most of the other days, however, I was playing basketball or football on the church grounds, playing basketball in this hot concrete box that we call the gymnasium right behind the building of our church. Now, I'll admit that my view of the church as sacred and holy space, however, didn't develop until my teenage years when in the late 1980s, our church in Brownsville, Texas became a sanctuary church, a place for refugees from Central America who were escaping war and violence in their home countries. They would stay a while, from a couple of days to a couple of weeks, while they figured out their next steps in the United States. I played basketball with many of them, men and women whose life circumstances I would not understand until much, much later. These experiences left a deep impression in my life that today fuels much of my interest in uncovering the history of how sacred spaces dwell in the neighborhoods that surround them and how they embody the transnational politics that have arisen as a result of globalization, immigration, and war. Now, my book focuses on these tensions in four of America's largest cities, that were central destination points where Mexican immigrants and Puerto Ricans arrived in large numbers throughout much of the 20th century. And thus the stories that I write about in Apostles of Change feature the children of these mass migrations to Los Angeles, to Houston, of course, New York City, and Chicago. Here, the 1960s generation of Chicanos and Puerto Ricans made it clear that they were prepared to risk their lives to fight for freedom, justice, and probably most importantly, a place to call home. Now, to get through all of this today, I'm going to try to hurry up. I'll focus on where it all began in Chicago. You can buy the book to read it or get it at your library to read the chapter on Houston, which some of you might have some interest in if you're from or know folks from the North Side, Barrio. But I'm going to focus on Chicago today. There, the fight against urban renewal prompted the occupation of McCormick's Seminary and later Armitage Methodist Church in May of 1969. Now, these occupations kicked off a national movement of Latino radical activist groups, occupying churches, disrupting services, each occupation lasting 5 to 14 days. And the one in Los Angeles, next slide, please, was actually a one-night disruption. This is one of my favorite photographs from Los Angeles. I think we could all agree that Christ did not own a Cadillac, right? In New York City, the Young Lords occupied the First Spanish United Methodist Church, and in a matter of 11 days, organized free clothing drives, breakfast programs, liberation schools, political education classes, and a daycare center, a free healthcare program. They did it in 11 days, folks. They were between the ages of 18 and 22 years old, so don't ever say you can't organize anything. These folks did it within a matter of 11 days, and it was brilliant and amazing. They painted a sign and they hung it at the front of the church. Bienvenidos a la Iglesia del Pueblo. Welcome to the People's Church. Next slide, please. This is a current picture of that First Spanish United Methodist Church in East Harlem in New York City. The occupation of the church attracted large crowds. The Young Lords received a lot of letters of support at that church, one of them coming from the Reverend David Kirk, that noted, and this has become now very famous, that if Christ were alive today, he would have been a young Lord. Imagine Christ with the purple beret, right? Obviously, and doing all of these social service programs. He certainly, if you know your Gospels, would have certainly been involved in work like that. I agree with Reverend Kirk for sure. In Houston, next slide, please. The Mexican American Youth Organization, or what we know as Mayo, occupied the Juan Marcos Presbyterian Church in the North Side Barrio, and like the Young Lords, did much of the same thing. A remarkable occupation that had support of community members, probably the most support of any of the other occupations from the North Side Barrio. And on top of that, it was the longest. They occupied the church for about 21 days. Now, each of these occupations garners the attention of white religious leaders across the country, but it also significantly helps the causes of Latino Catholics and Protestants within those churches. It created spaces where grassroots organizers provided mutual aid, as I've already mentioned. And in doing so, it wasn't new. Mutual aid was not new in the late 1960s. It's a long tradition within especially Mexican American communities that stretches back for over 100 years, when mutualistas organized at the barrio level without a regard for a person's immigration status, as a way to help Mexicans and other Latinos navigate life in the United States. Next slide, please. Now, let me shift back to where we started, Manuel Ramos and in Chicago. Days after Manuel Ramos's death, and as a way to protest urban renewal, members of the Lords, together with a community known as the Poor People's Coalition, and with the help from seminary students, walked onto the campus of McCormick Theological Seminary. And what you're seeing there is a picture of McCormick Seminary right after it had been occupied. They renamed it the Manuel Ramos Memorial Building as an homage to their good friend and a signal to the institutions in the neighborhood that urban renewal, or urban removal as they called it, was not going down without a fight. Now, the political rise of the Young Lords organization in Chicago, from a street gang that was organized in the late 1950s to revolutionary nationalists a decade later, they became, the Young Lords did, emblematic of a grassroots movement in Chicago neighborhoods and part of a broader rainbow coalition of politics in late 1960s Chicago. And if you haven't seen it already, I would highly recommend the film Judas and the Black Messiah, which tells the story of the Black Panther Party in Chicago and chairman and leader Fred Hampton, his murder by Chicago police. It documents it in that film. The Young Lords make a brief but a quite significant showing in that film. I would highly recommend it if you have not seen it as of yet. Now, what's interesting about the Young Lords, and again, this sort of gets at this idea of how we think about these movements and sort of their ethnic and racial makeup. They were predominantly Puerto Rican in Chicago. That's where they started. They later developed another chapter out in New York City, but they first started in Chicago. They were predominantly Puerto Rican, but not entirely. They had members who were Mexican, who were African American, and who were also white. And their engagements with a Presbyterian bureaucracy, the McCormick Seminary was part of the Presbyterian Church. They knew nothing about church leadership, and especially mainline Protestants like Presbyterians. But it put them, I think, really into a significant conversation, not only with white religious leaders, but also with Latino pastors. Next slide, please. And I'll show you a little bit about the neighborhood. So when I talk about Lincoln Park, see the map there of Chicago, the outlined area. This is just using Google Maps, by the way. I think I have fancier and prettier maps in the book that you can check out. But this gives you an idea of where exactly the Lincoln Park neighborhood is that I'm talking about, located in the near north side of the city. In the 1960s, imagine this area here of Lincoln Park as an area that was defined both by its ethnic mix and the shared experiences of displacement. Next slide. It also became the battleground, this is just a closer shot, for one of the most important fights against urban renewal, with a cast of characters that ranged from Puerto Rican nationalists to welfare mothers to seminary students. Seminary students who were overwhelmingly Anglo, that basically unlocked the doors for the young lords to come in and occupy the theological seminary there. More on this later. But first, picture this neighborhood in 1969, all right? Victorian brownstone homes near the lake on the east side to immigrant housing units to the west. And with plans for a shopping district. If any of you have ever been to Chicago, you've probably walked along the magnificent mile there. It's very, very beautiful. Lincoln Park at that time was one of the most competitive real estate markets in the city. Add to that the significant investments from the triad of institutions in the neighborhood. McCormick Seminary, DePaul University is there, and so was the Children's Memorial Hospital. And a market really where properties sold very, very quickly, and you begin to understand why Lincoln Park was targeted in the way that it was by urban renewal hawks in the 1950s. In 1954, the Lincoln Park Conservation Association requested an urban renewal designation for the neighborhood, which included $43 million, and that included a 50% matching funds from the federal government. So essentially by 1957, there's a total of about $160 million that is being invested in that neighborhood, just in that neighborhood, to completely transform it and make it into a tourist hub, raise rents, kick poor Black and brown people out for the most part who could no longer afford to live there. Now, these urban renewal trends in Chicago were part of a larger national project that began with federal legislation that focused on the redevelopment of what investors tagged crumbling neighborhoods, like what they thought of Lincoln Park, but that were in prime locations near business districts or attractive landscapes, just like Lincoln Park. By the end of the 1960s, in a city with nearly 250,000 Latinos in Chicago, urban renewal policies had normalized displacement, pushing Latinos in Chicago from neighborhood to neighborhood. Chicago's a city of neighborhoods, often into substandard housing units where in some cases they paid higher rents. Now, forcing Puerto Ricans and Mexicans out of neighborhoods, pricing them out of their homes, was part of a long tradition in the city of Chicago, whereas Mérida Rúa has put it, there existed a, quote, episodic pattern of constant movement, of loss and finding and more loss. Experiences of displacement are what made the young lords into the most radical and powerful Puerto Rican voice in the late 1960s. Common experiences around police brutality, around displacement and poverty that brought even non-Puerto Ricans to join the young lords. People such as Omar Lopez, who was a Mexican immigrant, undocumented at the time, and Kenny Smith, who was described himself as Appalachian and white, joined the Young Lords organization with a desire to fight the system that was stacked against them. Next slide, please. Now, as revolutionary nationalists, they built coalitions. This is a picture of the Armitage Methodist Church in Chicago. This is one of those food programs. People are gathered outside to pick up a plate, something to eat, and share in community with one another. All of this good work, I think, sometimes overlooks the fact that there were faith-based social movements that emerged out of Catholic and Protestant churches throughout the city of Chicago. Most of these were grounded in the early 20th century formulations of the social gospel. These movements blended faith and direct political action as a means to bring about social change. Now, the eclectic mix of social gospel and evangelicalism that characterized Chicago made it one of liberal Protestantism's most important cities during the first half of the 20th century. Next slide, please. By the late 1960s, there was this sort of link up between that reformist, liberal, Protestant and Catholic Chicago and the kind of radical politics, as the Chicago Daily News here calls it, the clergy radical link up in the North Side. Now, but why occupy a seminary, right? That was a question I had early on as well, because not only was McCormick Seminary one of the weakest institutions in the neighborhood. Remember, there was also a children's hospital and, of course, DePaul University there. But the lords believed, the young lords did, that they could exploit the seminary's hypocrisy, right? As a Christian institution, how could seminary students participate in the displacement of poor people, right? So everything starts on May 6, 1969. Next slide. When a coalition of close to 1,000 people that included the Northside Cooperative Ministry, the Young Lords, and seminary students rallied to protest the dedication of the newly built stone academic building. So the picture you see there, this was a brand new building that they had occupied. Black, Puerto Rican, and white community leaders joined McCormick students and faculty to voice their frustration over a building that had cost $2 million to build, just as people were losing their homes. In dramatic fashion, seminary students set up tent villages on campus. I don't have pictures of the tent villages because I couldn't find any really good ones, but believe me, they're there. They're blurry, they're not so good, but they were fantastic. Seminary students camped outside of the seminary as a symbolic act of solidarity with the mostly Black and Puerto Ricans that were being forced out of the neighborhood at that time. The next day, the seminary's newsletter described the scene at the stone building as one where, quote, a Wheaton, Illinois, one of the suburbs of Chicago, a Wheaton insurance man and a North suburban pastor brushed shoulders, as it were, with a young militant Puerto Rican leader and welfare mothers, end of quote. Another observer noted that children running around playing while their parents were there trying to keep up with them, some walking around with industrial workers of the world flags who shuffled back and forth between watching their kids and condemning seminary leaders. The occupation, I hope you understand it, was a family affair. It's very critical to see it as such. The next day, on May 7th, as McCormick administration met with its board of trustees, next slide, please, a coalition of students and community leaders. And this is one of this is one of the beauties of working in the archives, by the way. You find these great flyers and these great posters that were made up, and you see that were made up by the activists, and you see the sort of bulldozing of urban renewal and how McCormick Seminary was destroying the community and driving poor people out. But take a look towards the bottom. What I really love about this is come and protest urban renewal, but there's also going to be music, dancing, and fun, right? I mean, those are the kinds of protests that I love and I want to be a part of and to share with people the most. This is one of the beautiful finds of the archives. In their demands, they asked for money for low-income housing. They asked for facilities for a daycare, on and on, right? In terms of what it is that they were asking for. Each demand was carefully crafted. You can go to the next slide. Each demand was carefully crafted. You see the demands there. Was carefully crafted with the help of McCormick students and with the close guidance of a young man by the name of Obed Lopez, who at that time was the leader of another organization called the Latin American Defense Organization, sort of a pan-Latino organization in the city of Chicago. But in the end, none of this mattered. The board of McCormick Seminary rejected all of these demands, and that prompted a full occupation. The groups who have seized the building, there was a local socialist press reported, quote, are Black, they are Latin, they are white, and there are little red books everywhere, and there is evidence, and a clenched fist is the accepted greeting, right? The occupation of the stone building capped off a prosperous and turbulent decade for McCormick Seminary. In the 1960s, McCormick, even as it's rejecting all of these demands, was enjoying the benefits of increased enrollment. Donation dollars went through the roof. There were all kinds of financial, it was a financial windfall really in the 1960s, even as seminaries across the country were faced with strong and intense pushback from the rise of Latin American liberation theology and Black liberation theology at this time. Theological schools everywhere were faced with strong challenges from their students in an era of theological change primarily, right? Where we start to think about the understanding that God is on the side of the oppressed, that there is a preferential option for the poor, right? That Jesus is not a white, blue-eyed, blonde figure, right? That he was a darker brother, right? That he represented the poor masses of the world. And this was foundational. This raises moral and deep questions for seminaries and theological schools across the country. Now, when these demands are not met, they occupy the building. The occupation lasts 5 days. And there are a variety of reports inside the building, the negotiations that went on. But for the purposes of just trying to help you all understand what happened today, I'm going to fast forward really to where the story takes an unexpected turn. As it turns out, just as the Lords occupied the seminary building, the United Presbyterian Church, again, the denomination that owned McCormick Seminary, was beginning its 181st General Assembly in San Antonio. When the Lords stepped foot onto that seminary, Obed Lopez boarded a bus for San Antonio. You can go to the next slide. Lopez not only, go to the next one actually. Yeah, Lopez not only, there you go. Lopez not only worked his way onto the agenda as a delegate, but he also had the opportunity to meet James Forman. And if you see the picture that's up there, starting from left to right on your screen, the far left is Obed Lopez. Right next to him is Eleazar Risco from Los Angeles. He was actually one of the founding editors of La Raza newspaper, which is a very well-circulated, very popular newspaper for the Chicano movement. In the center there is James Forman, right next to him, with his hands out like that. And then right next to him is Gayrod Wilmore, who at the time was the leader of the focus around race and ethnicity within the Presbyterian Church. Some of you might remember or might know James Forman. He was a former SNCC leader that had put white church leaders on high alert with his bold demands in the Black Manifesto. The Black Manifesto not simply actually, it's very complicated, demanded that the church pay, that the white churches across the country pay $500 million in reparations for the monies that they garnered during the era of slavery. And church disruptions, he disrupted churches and church services across the Northeast, right? So the Presbyterians had invited Forman to come to their conference to talk about what was going on and to talk about the Black Manifesto. They did not expect Latinos to show up in the numbers that they did. Now, those who heard James Forman speak described his talk as witty, as knowledgeable, as scathing, and really, you heard Forman speak. It sounded really like one participant mentioned it. It was like a storm breaking around the heads of the church, really. The Latino contingent, however, seemed to, at least to church members there, pale in comparison. Latinos were quiet at this meeting. They were unassuming and, for the most part, largely unknown. People didn't know the history of Latinos in the late 1960s, right? Few in the audience that day felt threatened by any of the Latino clergy that were present, much certainly less by Obed Lopez. For white Presbyterians, Latinos were a people without a history. They were considered a, quote, invisible minority at this time. Next slide, please. So when Lopez,
hold on 1 second, Felipe. Yeah. We're having some electricity issues here in Kingwood, so I think we're okay. But if something goes bad, I just don't want y'all to think that that's what's going on. So back to you. This is
Thank you,
great.
John. I appreciate it. Let me just keep going, see how much we can make it through.
Yeah.
This is a picture of Obed Lopez, by the way. And when it's time for him to address the assembly, he carries a heavy burden. Not only did he have to compete with the charisma of James Foreman and the demands, but he also had to fill in the gap of Latinos in the United States. What is their history? He had to sort of tell them, this is who we are, this is where I come from. And he was only one representation from that. And he was from Chicago. He was a Mexican immigrant himself on that day when he goes forth. He gives his talk. He was convincing enough that the Presbyterian denomination agrees to provide the first demand of $601,000 for low-income housing. That is quite significant if you remember that first demand.
Mm-hmm.
What Obed Lopez does immediately is he calls to Chicago. He says, look, they're going to give us some, maybe not all, but they're going to give us some. Call off the occupation, and that's where it closes. The following months after that occupation, during the so-called Rainbow Summer of 1969, McCormick Seminary, with the help of the Chicago Presbytery and of the National Board of Missions, starts delivering the funds to the Young Lords and to the Poor People's Coalition that had occupied the seminary. Here's what they do with that money. They hire Howard Allen and Associates, an architectural firm, to draw up a competitive bid for low-income housing in Lincoln Park that they could then submit to the city of Chicago to present as a competitive bid, right? That if the city of Chicago would approve it, that perhaps you could have a mixed income housing neighborhood in Lincoln Park and people would not have to be forced out. Even so, there were a lot of deep frustrations during that summer, and you can go to the next slide. The Young Lords go on to occupy the Armitage People's Church. This is another one of the great flyers that I love. If you're going to occupy a church, you might as well have music and singing, and you might as well have food and free meals and so forth. And that's exactly what they did. You can go to the next slide as well. This is a great picture, one of my favorite pictures actually, of the Armitage Methodist Church, which is where they used as their home base. The Young Lords did after they had occupied McCormick Seminary. They used this as their home base to work with the architectural firm to develop plans for mixed income housing. And if you can see the sign right there at the front, the People's Church, La Iglesia de la Gente. It's one of my favorite pictures that I found throughout this research. Now, even as they were doing all of this and they were gaining some traction, there were some hiccups along the road. There were some Latino pastors within the Presbyterian Church that were not as supportive. They had to fight back against that. I won't go too much into that, but if you have some questions about the responses of Latino pastors, I can talk more about that during the Q&A time. Go to the next slide, John. Now, by the spring of 1970, there is a plan, and you can see this. Poor people hire an architect and get directly into the housing picture of Chicago. This was the vision for mixed income housing, right? This included a 36-unit apartment complex with plans to expand to 70. 45% of the homes would be affordable housing for low-income families. The federal government only stipulated that you needed 15% of the homes to be there. This was a lot higher than that. They wanted to design homes and apartment complexes where you could host parties, where you could hang out, where moms and dads could be cleaning the house or working there, but also have their eyes on the kids on the streets. It was a beautiful, beautiful plan from what you can see here. As a matter of fact, the Chicago Sun-Times calls the proposal imaginative and really urges the city of Chicago to approve it, right? They passed this plan to Mayor Daley. There were 3 major competitive plans that went up for support from the city of Chicago. And the other thing that I should note before I forget is that this proposal, while it was focused on mixed income housing, also won the support of Lincoln Park's white conservative majority. This was a huge, huge victory and something that had really not happened anytime before. This, I think, should have sealed the deal for Lincoln Park's future if the city of Chicago would have approved the bid. but instead it only fired up city leaders who, at the end of the day, ignored the community's choice for this housing proposal, something it had never done. When neighborhoods submitted their housing bids and they had overwhelming support, it was a rubber stamp by the city of Chicago. Not in this case. Instead, they selected another housing bid that didn't even come close to the low-income and mixed-income housing vision of the Poor People's Coalition and of the Young Lords. It was a better fit with what the city of Chicago wanted in terms of development and prosperity, economic prosperity for that neighborhood. This was a crushing loss for the Young Lords. Now, you could not have scripted a better plan of action when we think about organizing. The Young Lords and the Poor People's Coalition, they occupied this building. They hired an architect when they got the money. They didn't just foolishly spend the money on things that were not going to be practical and needed. This was a very savvy group of activists. They got the Chicago Housing Authority to ensure that they would secure 40% of the units for low-income families. And perhaps in their greatest victory, they won the support of their enemies in Lincoln Park, the pro-urban renewal group in Lincoln Park that supported this bid. As the more than 300 members of the Poor People's Coalition crowded into the City Hall, the news that the Department of Urban Renewal had rejected their bid brought out an auditory gasp from the community. The Lords, the Young Lords, and Lincoln Park in general would never recover after that, never be the same. And perhaps it is this loss, and as I wrap up the talk here, this valiant push to put the brakes on urban renewal in Chicago that fails, that has kept the Young Lords from their place among some of the most important civil rights groups of their generation. When the decision came down in the spring of 1970 to reject this housing bid, it had been more than a year of organizing, coupled with stints in jail. I don't want to romanticize any of these folks. They were young people, so they were doing stuff that was, probably not the best, but whatever. They did what they did. They were frustrated, they were angry, they were heavily surveilled by the FBI, and they were flat out exhausted by the spring of 1970. It was a sense of loss that would prove to be the most difficult hurdle to overcome. As bad as this loss was, McCormick Seminary does in fact begin to institute Latino theological studies. They start hiring more Black and Latino faculty. It's a complete change that in the world of religious studies and theological studies parallels the rise of Chicano and Puerto Rican ethnic studies, right? It's another sort of formulation of the kind of impact that the civil rights movement, that the Latino freedom movement had on academic curriculum and higher education. Go to the last slide, go to the next slide. So I end where I began, with Manuel Ramos, the loss of a dear friend, a comrade in the struggle. He was a husband, remember, a father of 2 babies, who changed the course of his family's history and that of the Young Lords. In the days after the low-income housing proposal from the coalition was rejected by the city, activists continued to pay a heavy price. On March 23, 1970, the offices of the Latin American Defense Organization were ransacked and burned to the ground. The Young Lords were surveilled by the FBI, and the Reverend Bruce and Jeannie Johnson, the preachers, the pastors of that Armitage Methodist Church that I showed you a picture of, were brutally killed in their home. It's a murder that remains to this day unsolved. And at the end of the year, in December of 1969, Fred Hampton, the chairman of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party, was murdered by Chicago police. In Chicago, the Young Lords worked at a dizzying pace to reduce gang violence, to make sure that people had what it was that they needed. And oftentimes, they're not remembered for much of the excellent work that they did. And you can go to the next slide. In occupying these churches, they were responsive to the needs of their barrio. They were about bringing attention to a system of inequality. They were about a kinship, a cooperation, across neighborhoods and across barrios with people of different racial and ethnic groups to move back, to push back against a normalized displacement, against the pushback of urban renewal that had come to be regular, that had come to be common sense in Chicago. And this is, I believe, this people's church idea, right, of mutual aid, is, I believe, the continued legacy of the kind of religious reform that follows in the 1970s. And I think of the significant work that these young radicals and reformers did in the Lincoln Park neighborhood. Occupiers and clergy that supported these movements tapped into a tradition of mutual aid in the midst of violence and displacement, and laid the groundwork for a progressive religious movement that remains at the forefront of our movements for justice today. Just think about the immigrant rights movement, the kind of mutual aid that is formulated across the United States and across the world in the midst of a global pandemic. And you see remnants, right? You see the ideas that are planted and that we see flourish during the Latino freedom movement. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop there. Thank you, John. I think we made it, right, through this storm?
We did. We did. I'm going to stop sharing now, and it'll just be you and me, and we'll get to some of these questions.
Great.
And there are several. Okay, so the first question is from David, and he wanted you to distinguish between the Lords. What are the differences between the Lords and other 1960s social movements?
Yeah, no, great question. I mean, I think there was a heavy emphasis on a kind of revolutionary nationalism that was central to their militancy. And by that, I mean several things. Number one, the fact that it was coalition-based, the cooperation with African-American groups, the cooperation with different Latino subgroups within their politic. Mm-hmm. The other is a very sort of strident critique on capitalism and the joining and the thinking of race, systemic inequality as an outgrowth of capitalism and racism in the United States. And so in those developments, they were, I think, really in a sphere of their own in terms of that sort of development. I think there were other Chicano groups. Certainly Mayo is reflective of this, the Mexican American Youth Organization in Houston. That might be contested of me saying that, but I do believe that Mayo had a kind of revolutionary nationalist politics because they were in Houston. You can't really organize in the city of Houston without being multi-ethnic and multiracial, just like Mayo was.
One comment from Michelle Cantu Wilson is about the flyers. Those are so awesome.
They were my favorite. And that kind of material, the materiality of the archive there that comes out and you find, it was the social media of the day, right? It's the Instagram of the day. And, I think oftentimes we separate the kind of radical politics from their humanity, from the fact that these were young people that, even as much as they cared about their community and radical politics, they also wanted to have a good time. They wanted to dance. They wanted to listen to music and chill and, smoke weed, whatever they had, whatever they wanted to do on and off, So I think it's great.
Okay, the next question, actually, there's several people that have commented on this, so I'm going to try to put it in. Clearly, there's a focus on Hispanic issues, but they're reaching out to other groups. How can you elaborate a little more on what issues they try to use to bring people together? I guess you mentioned the capitalism issue, but I hope I'm putting this correctly because there are several comments on this. Go ahead.
I mean, I think what really, starts to be sort of central is, number one, when we think about just race, right, within the Latino community, the first picture that I showed you in the slide was of Jose Chacha Jimenez. Chacha Jimenez was very light-skinned, colored eyes. If people, would have seen him on the streets, they might have thought that he was, white. Within the Latino community, there's a range of skin colors and tones. Obviously, Afro-Latinos, white Latino, there's a range within that. And so to just focus on race or use race as a sort of commonality was somewhat limiting, right? What really, I think I find in terms of these coalitions that begin to be built in barrios, and I think that's the epicenter, right? That's the place where Latino history emerges and where it thrives, is this notion of displacement and migration and movement. This is an experience that comes from Latin America, the movement out of Latin America to the United States, of being displaced because of U.S. intervention and colonialism, and then coming to the United States and that displacement continuing. That's what historian George Sanchez talks about in terms of a common experience around colonialism, immigration, and racial formation that you can't separate from economic status and class. And so all of those things are, really the unifier, right? The fact that everybody was being pushed out, and economics was what brought a lot of these groups together, and a kind of political vision of the world as well.
This is my question, but what was the specific critique of capitalism? What was it that what was animating that, in other words?
Well, I mean, I think primarily in terms of the availability of, or the tendency really of capitalism to create a kind of abundant wealth for very few, and leaving others out of the possibility for a kind of social movement up to, a gaining of economic status, in other words, right? And so there wasn't a belief, which was kind of a strict belief of liberal reformers during the 20th century, that education could be a form of social uplift, that getting a good job, that speaking English, that capitalism was our way out of poverty, right? And what the Young Lords believed was really that it was socialism, a socialist vision for society where people share resources and where there is that kind of connectivity, because capitalism had just been reflected as a form of displacement and as a form of benefiting people that were already in places and positions of power, tending to be heavily white in the United States, and tending to live in areas that, as urban renewal was targeting, were economically profitable for some.
One thing that's interesting to me about this is I grew up in a Presbyterian church. So,
oh, you did?
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure. So one of the more interesting trends in religion, I think, over the last 40 years has been this rise of what we call the nones, N-O-N-E-S, people who don't claim any religion. So can you talk a little bit about what your sense of what is the role of the church now in Hispanic social reform movements? Where is it? How do you see that?
Well, I'll say something.
That question makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I appreciate the question. I'm glad we're going there, because I think oftentimes Latino religious communities are blamed for maybe the higher voter turnout for Trump. People blame evangelicals or people within church settings. Part of that could be true. I think it's a fair critique. But for me, I think there's been a kind of an overabundance and an over focus in the literature and in the news media on the kind of conservative politics within the church. What I think we miss oftentimes is a kind of grassroots and local politics that many churches, sometimes quietly, sometimes not as loud, are involved in. I mean, I think we'll all criticize Joel Osteen and that big church for locking its doors during Hurricane Harvey and other hurricanes that have come through the city of Houston. But we forget, or maybe we're not aware or as cognizant in the news media and in other spaces, of the power of the local church to respond to its community and barrio needs. And I think that is something that we have seen most powerfully in the midst of this pandemic. I've continued talking to church leaders during this pandemic and talking to them about how they dealt with this transition, how they dealt with going from a space of, the church being a space of worship to the church being a space of social outreach and food pantries and providing medical attention to folks who needed it. And even with the summer of 2020 and the murder of George Floyd, talking to one pastor out in Los Angeles whose congregation mostly was Central American and mostly immigrant, really out of the murder of George Floyd, beginning to ask some deep and profound questions about the place of Latinos in American society, and wanting the church to do more kind of Latino history within the church, kind of a Sunday school version, to bring in a history textbook and to learn about the United Farm Worker Movement or about the place of Latinos in society. So churches, even as these numbers dwindle, and you mentioned the nuns, right? The folks that are not necessarily as much in the pews. And I think there's another side to that in terms of the role that the church plays as a space for where people can get continued education where people can advocate for immigrant rights, and where these large institutions can be used as spaces for sanctuary, as they have been certainly since the 1980s.
Okay, this is a really good question here from, says, this was a great presentation, enjoyed it thoroughly. Thinking about this urban removal reminds me of what environmental justice advocates often refer to as slow-moving violence. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Well, that's a great point and a great, I think, connection to make. I mean, I think, oftentimes what we don't see is the kind of slow impact that these mega large scale policies, federal policies in these cases, the wreckage that they were having on people's everyday lives, whether it was reduced access to healthcare or education, or the fact that city parks were being destroyed, right? And people were having to move elsewhere, or the fact that, then if you can't play outside or kids can't enjoy, the benefits of the neighborhood, or there's more potential for harm. I think, sometimes we miss how slowly these things happen. And then all of a sudden, when it does break, when Lincoln Park, when all of this money comes into Lincoln Park and there's a kind of transformation of the neighborhood and people kicked out, we forget that this was a long process, right? That racism takes place over a long period of time, and that to understand it, we might only see the tip of that iceberg. We might only see the kind of KKK or the kind of Confederate statues or the kind of struggles we're having here at A&M with Confederate statues, right? But really what lies beneath is what's most dangerous. That's where the iceberg, if you think about the strength of an iceberg below the water, the part that you don't see happening is what can really destroy you and what can really kill, communities. And I think the young lords recognizing that and wanting to move quickly to it, and then attacking a colonial institution like the church to bring about rapid change. For me, it was a brilliant move. If you think about, Presbyterians, there is a network of religious institutions across the country. As soon as something goes down in Chicago, people hear about it in New York, San Antonio, LA. It moves very, very quickly. And so I think that was powerful on their part to try to speed up the kind of reaction from religious leaders and say, if you do care about the poor, if you are a religious person, then you must care about displacement, and we need to do something now.
Okay, we're about out of time. So I'm going to ask one final question because I think this is relevant, and that is, what would you say to our students about what difference they could make? If you think that's a good concluding question, I think
that's a great concluding question. I think one of the things that, and I know that there's a lot of really great faculty out there that are teaching this and that talk about the civil rights movement and the Chicano movement, that are doing this already. And I know I share in, this realization, this hope that we have when we talk to our students about this, because you start to quickly realize that if you were 25 years old and in these movements, you were an old cat. You know what I mean? So it was like, these were, you look at the ages of some of these folks, they were young. They were between the ages of 16 in some cases, up to 20, 21 years of age. But they had a belief inspired by the Black freedom struggle, inspired by the Red Power movement, inspired by Asian American activists in different sectors of the movement across the country, third world movements across the globe, that you could do something, that there were a politics of the possible that you could engage in, and that your voice did matter. And my hope is that my students capture that, and that I join them, that democracy, that American democracy has not been settled, that it's not something that was taken care of during World War II. And now we can all check Instagram and be on social media all day, right? That we have to continue working for it. And I'm just honored every day to join in any way I can with my students to be a part of it.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And I would like to thank everybody for attending today. Some great questions, and this was a lot of fun. And when you have your next book, obviously, we'll have you back again.
Thank you, John. I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for coming out.
Be sure to follow us on social media at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Like this video, leave a comment, and hit that subscribe button to be notified about our latest content.